Welcome to the Gifts for Glory podcast, where we celebrate and promote men and women using their gifts for God's glory. Know someone who is making an impact for God's kingdom using their gifts, talents, and passions? We'd love to meet them. Send us an email at podcast@giftsforglory.com. That's podcast@gifts4glory.com. And now here is our host, Dave Ebert.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the latest edition of the Gift for Glory podcast. I am Dave Ebert, and I'm really excited to have you along with us this evening. It's going to be a great show. We've got a great guest for you, Sandy Kirkham. She is an author, she's a speaker, and she's an advocate, and we're going to learn a lot about her and her story. It's a powerful story of God's redemptive power and healing, and you're not going to want to miss this. For little ears, some of the story might be a little bit disturbing, so just a little discretion ahead of time because we want to just be transparent here on the podcast. So just keep that all in mind. But thank you so much for joining us. We're going to dive right into our Gifts for Glory Devotions with Dave segment. We're going to be reading from 1 Corinthians 10:13. 1 Corinthians 10:13. I'm going to read from the New Living Translation. The temptations in your life are no different from what others experience, and God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, He will show you a way out so that you can endure. So let's read that one more time. The temptations in your life are no different from what others experience, and God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, He will show you a way out so that you can endure. And that's 1 Corinthians 10:13. And I really like this verse. First, because it's one that I like to share with people to kind of correct wrong thinking. There is something that's kind of an extra biblical saying that's often attributed to God, that God will not give you more than you can handle. Somewhat, I kind of agree, because not necessarily is everything that you go through is it something God's given you, but God will use it. But it's not that God doesn't give you more than you can handle. He doesn't allow the temptation to be so much that you can't stand, because when you are tempted, He will show you a way out so that you can endure. But a lot of people, I say, God doesn't give you more than you can handle. Well, we can't handle this life. That's why we needed a Savior. That's why God needed to send Jesus. So there are things that we can't handle because we need God. We're designed to be in communion and fellowship with God. We're designed to have a relationship with Him. And there are things that we cannot withstand on our own without His power. We make mistakes. We fall. We sin. We do things that hurt other people. We do things that hurt ourselves. So sometimes God does allow more than we can handle to happen because it allows us to realize that we need Him. He built us so that we could be in relationship with Him. But the great news is that the temptations in your life are no different than what others experience. God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. Now, temptation in of itself is not the sin. It's the second look. It's the pondering on it. It's the pursuit of what the temptation is. That's where sin happens. Temptation is not sin. So don't condemn yourself because you were tempted. Condemnation is not in God's economy. So I just want to encourage you that temptation is not sin, and we need to be in a relationship with God because He's going to help carry us through in this life that's full of challenges. So I hope that's encouraging, and I hope that you will dive into your word and especially check out Corinthians. My wife and I studied the Corinthians recently in our ISOM class. And this verse was 1 Corinthians 10:13. I read out of the NLT version. Choose your version that you prefer. So that was our Devotions with Dave segment for the week. And now let's get on to our guest. Our guest is author Sandy Phillips Kirkham. Her book is Let Me Pray Upon You. It's a transparent, vulnerable, and I believe in some ways probably a healing in its own right autobiography of her experiences with clergy abuse. She's a speaker, advocate, wife, mother, grandmother, and parent to one fairly well-behaved dog with a puppy on the way. We're going to dive into her incredible story of abuse, pain, embarrassment, and ultimately healing and redemption. So please welcome our guest at this time, Sandy Phillips Kirkham. Sandy, welcome to the Gifts for Glory podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I heard you about almost 2 months ago, I think. Was it the Other People's Shoes podcast?
Yes.
And you were on there. You shared your story. I'm like, wow, I want to share this story because it's so powerful, and it's something that's so prevalent. You hear almost seems like weekly that another pastor has fallen into some sort of abuse, whether it's abuse of power that led into adultery or into even more drastic situations like your story. I don't want to tell it for you because I think that the audience is going to want to hear it directly from you. But your book, how long has it been out? Let me pray upon you.
It came out in December of 2018. So just over a year, a little over a year.
Okay.
No, 2 years. Yeah. December 2018.
Now, to write a book that's so transparent, take us through the journey of how you decided to put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard to write something that's that transparent. Was it an easy decision, or did it take a long time for God to kind of work that out?
It wasn't an easy decision. I had no intentions of ever writing a book, but I was frustrated by the lack of understanding of the dynamics of clergy abuse. I was frustrated by the response of some churches that I had seen where there was clergy abuse that had happened and it was swept under the rug. And so the frustration just grew. And I had been sharing my story and doing speaking engagements. And so many times people would come up to me and say, oh my gosh, you need to write a book. Your story just inspired me. Or, I'm so moved by what your story says in it. And you need to write a book. And I'm thinking, I'm not a writer. I don't want to write a book. But, God moves us in ways that sometimes we need a little push. And so there was just a day in my kitchen. I just thought, I do need to write this book. And so I sat down. It wasn't easy to write. I had to relive a lot of the memories. But I kept at it. I sometimes would write 2 hours a day. Sometimes I only wrote for a couple minutes, but I made myself write every single day, and it was difficult at times, but it was, as you pointed out, very healing as well. I felt God's hand on mine. When I felt like I couldn't write anymore, I had an inspiration that I felt was only from God. And so the book finally was finished. And it's been a help to people. I know that now. I've gotten so many emails, and I wrote the book really for two reasons. One, as I said, I really wanted to educate and raise awareness about clergy abuse, but I also wanted to help victims because so many times over the years, I've wondered how my life would have changed if I'd heard someone's story when this abuse was happening to me, because I thought I was the only one. And I didn't know how to cope with this, but if I'd heard someone's story, maybe I would have been able to come forward and tell someone. And so I'm hoping that my story will encourage others who have been through the same thing.
And I think that it would be encouraging even to people who have not been through the exact same abuse, but just knowing that, and I think it's a tool of the enemy is to convince us that whatever we're going through, whether it's clergy sexual abuse, which is what your book is subtitled, or it's any other kind of abuse within the church. Not that we're saying that the church is full of it, but there's enough to be concerned, because if there's one case, that's one too many, and we need to, within the context of what Scripture tells us, handle those sins. And unfortunately, the enemy makes us feel isolated and makes us feel either ashamed that it happened, or it makes us feel like, oh, you're the only one, and because you're the only one, no one's going to believe you.
And our abusers do that as well. They, through, Satan himself, they tell us no one's going to believe you if you tell. I mean, my abuser kept, his thing was, if you tell anyone, you're going to be responsible for what happens to me and what happens to this church. No one's going to believe you, and you're going to be blamed. And so, you're told that over and over and over again, to the point where, I knew that I just couldn't tell anyone. And there wasn't anyone I felt that I could tell, in spite of the fact, looking back, of course, there were many people I could have told who would have believed me. But our abusers are very clever at making sure we understand that the secret must be kept.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive in to your story about how you got to the abuse. were you raised in a Christian home,
Um,
or?
well, not a traditional Christian home. No, my parents didn't attend church. I started attending church when I was about 8 years old. My best friend who lived up the street invited me to go, and I, from the very beginning, just fell in love with church. I loved every aspect of it, and as I grew in my faith, I started to become more involved in the church. I taught Sunday school. I sang in the choir. I was baptized when I was 13, and from that moment on, it was a special moment for me that I really then began to live my faith, and everything about church and that my serving my God was so important to me. It was just, I've said it many times, but if the doors of the church were open, I was there. It was just that kind of a relationship I had. And the people there loved me and I loved them. They supported me. It was just a wonderful place that I found peace and I found happiness. Just after I turned 16, our church hired a new youth pastor. And he was very dynamic. He was very charismatic. He had come with great credentials. Prior to coming to our church, he had grew the youth group in his prior church, numbers beyond numbers. So our church was very excited about having this pastor come on board. And he was treated like a rock star. He just was incredible. Now, about, I don't know, a few weeks after he was hired at our church, a young woman from his first church came forward and accused him of sexual misconduct. The elders confronted him, and he didn't deny it. He said it was a mistake, that it would never happen again. Within 6 months of that accusation, he was kissing me in my hallway. It was after a youth group meeting. He came over to me after everyone left. It was in my house, and I thought it was odd that he was still there because he normally didn't stay late for all of the program. He would come and meet people and then he would leave, but he was late there that night. And he just walked up to me and began telling me how wonderful I was and how great the youth group was growing and how much he appreciated the work I was doing in the church. And then he just bent down and he kissed me. And I was stunned because I thought, I think he just kissed me, but this is my youth pastor, and I don't think he would be doing anything he shouldn't be doing. And I didn't know how to process it. So I thought, well, this is just his way of showing how much he appreciates what I've been doing. And he was very demonstrative, and he always hugged people. He was hugging men, women, it didn't matter. He was always saying things like, I love you. It was never, I love you in Christ, or love you as my brother and sister. It was, I love you. And he kind of pushed those boundaries a little bit. So I think it just, for me, it was like, well, this is just something I should just accept because I don't know what else to do with it. I couldn't imagine that he would be doing anything he shouldn't have been doing. And then I babysat for his family. And that's probably where his opportunities really were there to continually take advantage of me. It was a grooming process. I mean, he spent an entire year putting me in leadership position, telling me how wonderful I was. We would spend time talking about the Bible. He really brought me into his inner circle. And so I was slowly being drawn in to him. And eventually, about a year later, he had sex with me. And that changed everything from then on because I knew that was wrong. And I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to process it. And I think, if you read the book, you can hopefully see that the fear that I felt that moment when I knew that that's what was going to happen. And then I felt trapped. I didn't feel like I could tell anyone. Of course, he made me sure I didn't tell anyone. And I just accepted it, that this was what I was supposed to do. And of course, as many of them do, they twist scripture. He began to tell me, well, this was God's will and that we were married in God's eyes. I've learned since I've worked with many, many victims that that's a line a lot of them use. We're married in God's eyes. And that helps the victim accept it because, well, if this is God's working through him to me, then I need to believe and accept this. He often referred himself as David in the Bible. So the abuse lasted 5 years. It went on for 5 years. He became very controlling. He physically hit me. It wasn't a constant thing, but I was very much aware that at any time, if I didn't fall in line and do as he said, he could be violent with me. And that was scary to me. He was controlled the way I dressed. He controlled what friends I could see. I was very much isolated and in his world, and I just felt like I was in a black hole with no way out. And it lasted 5 years until two people from the church became a little suspicious and followed him one night, and they found us. And he was moved to the next church, and I was called in by the elders and told that because of my behavior, I was to leave the church. And I can still get upset. I was devastated. I was devastated. I couldn't believe that I was being told to leave a church that I loved. And, I watched them forgive him, but they weren't going to forgive me. And I've often said the response of that church probably had more of an impact on my spiritual life 20-something years later than the actual abuse did. And then so for 27 years, I kept a secret. I never told anyone. My husband didn't know. My friends didn't know. I kept the secret for 27 years till a trigger factor forced me to deal with my past. I opened the book with that trigger factor. I was just emotionally overwrought and didn't know what to do. And I knew then that I was going to have to deal with my past and figure out what was really done to me. And that this wasn't about love. This wasn't about someone who cared about me. This was abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to that first night when you're 16 and he leaned in to kiss you, was there any sign, looking back, obviously hindsight is 20/20, but was there any moment before then that you felt like something's not right? Or was it just that night he took a chance and caught you so off guard that you didn't know what to do with it?
He caught me totally off guard. I had absolutely no inkling that this was going to happen, that he had any intentions other than being the minister that was trying to help me. And the kiss was kind of this soft, quick kiss. And I've since learned that many times that's when they're abusing someone, that's the first thing they do is do something that they can brush off later to say, oh, I meant to kiss her on the forehead and I didn't mean, it wasn't an impassionate kiss. They can find an excuse. If he had pushed me up against the wall and tried to violently kiss me or to hug me, I would have reacted differently and thought, what is he doing? He's attacking me. He didn't do that. He knew not to do that. He knew that if he just did this subtle kiss, that maybe she'll let me do that. And I did. And then it progressed after that.
And so, it went from that kiss to eventually, no other word for it than rape. You said it was about a 6-month progress from that kiss to...
It was about a year. It was a year.
About a year? Okay.
Mm-hmm. And I was 16 when he kissed me. I was 17 when he had sex with me.
And was anybody during that time, the year of grooming, then the additional 4 years or so that this went on, was anybody curious? Were your parents ever wondering why you're with this guy so much? Or
well, people have asked me that, and the thing is, I was in church. I'm going on hospital visits. I'm singing in the choir. I'm teaching Sunday school. Everyone saw his interest in not just me, but any of the other kids as well, is a positive thing. So no, and this was in 1971, 72. So we weren't aware of the things we are now of clergy abuse. We're not aware of the terms grooming and manipulation. And so it probably wasn't in anyone's realm of thinking that this would be anything but, innocent, that this man is only there to help someone. Now, I did have one youth group leader who did suspect something, and she confronted me and asked me, and I was so close to telling her, but all I kept hearing in the back of my mind was, if I say anything, he's going to be so mad, and I can't say anything. I was so fearful to say anything. She then confronted him, and he became angry and basically told her, you can't trust me, then you need to leave this church. And it was, which I told people, that's an indication something's wrong right there. If someone is falsely accused, the first thing they're probably going to say is, oh my, that's not, I would never do anything like that. And he was very, almost angry. He was angry at her for even accusing him of something like that. Right. And that's a sign, that's not a reaction of someone who's innocent. So she was one, but people later have said to me, in hindsight, of course, they said, I remember that time that he said this to you, and I thought that was odd. But again, I don't think anyone pursued it. And so I tell church leaders, and I tell those in congregations when I speak to them, if you see something that seems a little off, just start paying attention. There's a reason you have a gut reaction. Doesn't mean you go peeping around corners and looking at everything. But if something's off, it's okay to question it a little bit. And it's a behavior, that's the other thing. If it's behavior that you wouldn't accept in someone else, then don't accept it in the pastor or the rabbi or the priest.
Mm-hmm.
Look at it and say, if that were, because I've said, if he would have been my 30-year-old neighbor down the street, when I was babysitting, he wouldn't take me home. He'd sit and talk to me, and we'd talk about the Bible. We'd talk about different things. He'd say, stay and, I just want to enjoy your company. Okay, I can do that. I didn't have a car, so I had to wait till he took me home. But if that had been my 30-year-old neighbor, I know I would have gone home to my mom and said, okay, this is weird. This guy wants me to sit and talk with him all evening. I have nothing to talk to this 30-year-old man with. So yeah, because they're in that position, we give them a little more credibility. We give them more trust. And then those who are not godly men, wolves in sheep's clothing, will then abuse that trust.
Yeah.
And as far as my parents go, this was an age when drugs were just starting, free sex. So for them to have a 16-year-old daughter who was just in love with the church, and that's where she spent all of her time, they didn't have any worries.
They were at this point where they didn't want to look the gift horse in the mouth. They wanted to say, all right, she's going to church. She's safe.
Right. And you should expect to be safe at church. That should be a place you should feel safe. And when we discover someone who has been committing sexual misconduct, we need to deal with it, because it's not a place for those men to be. Right.
Absolutely. So you get found out, it's been 5 years, so you're about 21 when you're found out. The two church leaders are suspecting something's going on, so they find you 21. Was there ever a conversation with you, like, how long has this been going on, or how did this start? They just made the assumption that you, a 21-year-old girl, just happened to start doing this thing with...
Well, they also made that assumption, I'm sure, because they certainly were talking to him. And so he was giving his version of what was going on. He did call me and say to me, I need you to say one thing and tell them that it had only been going on for a year, which I did, because I was still under his control and power. And I at that point, I was shaking out of my skin, because I didn't know what was going to happen. And this is blowing up in the church. I'm embarrassed. So I was never asked, but he said, if I'm asked, you just tell them. And I'm sure that's what he said, that I was 20 when it started, only been going on for a year, because first of all, he didn't want to admit that I was 16. But the second thing was, you can be forgiven. He felt like he could be forgiven if, okay, I made a mistake, it went on for a year. It'd be a little harder to make that argument if it had been going on the entire time of his ministry. Yeah. To think that those people sat in those pews every Sunday morning, listening to him preach on the sanctity of marriage and talk about how we should care for each other, while he's having sex with me, abusing me violently. Those are the kinds of things that would be hard to say, okay, we can forgive him. No. And so he had to spin the story. And I'm sure that I was blamed, and that, I pursued him, which I do remember thinking, and victims do this, they have guilt. And I do remember thinking, did I do anything that made him think I wanted him to do this? I was so confused as to why this man would do this, that I began to think maybe I did something that encouraged him. Right. I look back and I know that wasn't the case.
So you get found out, from what I understand, it was at a hotel room. They found you in a hotel with this pastor, who was no longer your youth pastor. He'd been moved up, from what I understand. He was now the lead pastor at this church. So that's why there's this new lady that was the youth pastor that suspected something. So he's now leading a church and speaking on Sundays, while he's also living this second life, kind of being this double-minded man. And this whole time, where was your spiritual walk at that point? Were you still in prayer at all? Were you still in any kind of relationship with the Lord, or had that been?
Yeah, it was waning very much so. The guilt was just eating me alive. In fact, there were 2 times that I did try to get out of it. And I went to him and I said to him, I just can't do this anymore. I feel guilty and we shouldn't be doing this. And then he usually would respond in one of 2 ways. One, he would say to me, you're never going to find anybody who's going to love you because you're not a virgin, and I'm the only one that's going to be able to love you, and you'll never be able to leave me. And why do you think you have any right to think you can leave me? And I would just shrivel into this little corner and say, oh, you're probably right. And I don't know, but, and again, I had no one to bounce anything off of to say, here's what he's telling me. What should I do? I was totally engrossed in his world. The other reaction would be to make me feel guilty in the sense that I need you, this church needs you. How could you think of leaving me? What would I do without you? So it was, this feeling of obligation that I owed him to stay in this relationship for all that he'd done to help me. There's an acronym that's used by Susan Forward. It's called FOG, F-O-G, and it's fear, obligation, and guilt that keep abused women inside relationships. It's fear, there's an obligation you feel, and then there's guilt. And I think I felt all 3 of those. And again, I couldn't figure out how to get out. And he knew that. I could go crying every day of the week to him that I wanted to leave and it wasn't going to happen. And he knew that. So I forgot your question, but what was your question?
That was basically where was your,
my spiritual life. Yeah. That was beginning to wane because I did feel so guilty. And then eventually I just accepted the relationship. And by doing that, I really kind of cut myself off from God because I was trying to reconcile this man who was having sex with me and then preaching on Sunday morning, and it just wasn't working. And so I just said, this isn't going to be it. So I didn't pray as much. I quit teaching Sunday school. I didn't sing in the choir anymore. It was a slow withdrawal from my church life and my spiritual life.
It was almost as if you were withdrawing to also prevent anyone from noticing that something was wrong.
Probably, yeah. I had to be very careful to make sure that no one suspected anything because, he was very clear that no one could ever find out because I would be responsible for what would happen to him. And of course, I didn't want anyone to know this about me. I felt as guilty too, which I had no right to feel guilty because I was taken advantage by this person I should have been able to trust. And he used his position to do that.
So not only did this pastor, who is not named in your book, I believe you left all names other than your own out. Mm-hmm. So this pastor, he's found out he's been abusing you. The church assumes it's only been for a year. And so they allow him to basically slip away to another church while also kicking you out, giving you a double whammy of church hurt. Not only is this pastor, abused you for now 5 years, now the church leadership is abusing you by treating you like you have a scarlet letter when you were the victim.
Right. And I know that people say, well, that was 27 years ago, or, it's been longer than that, and things are different. And sadly to say, many times they're not. Victims are still blamed. And while I've had many victims say to me, I wasn't told to leave the church, but I was called in and said, maybe it would be better if you found another church, as if to say, we don't want you here because we don't want to be reminded of it. And we don't know what to do with you. And we would just assume you go someplace else is the message. So it does still happen. And let me be fair, I guess, to some extent. It's very hard sometimes for church leadership to discipline one of their own. Mm-hmm. And it's difficult when that person's been the one who's baptized your children, or he's married your children, or he sat at your bedside while your mother was dying. It's hard for them to reconcile that this person they think they know is guilty of these evil acts. And so they struggle with that. And in doing so, their response is inappropriate and it's hurtful. And we've got to get past that. We've got to get to a point where we understand that these are wolves in sheep's clothing. They're not one of us. They pretend to be one of us. Now, I say that, but that doesn't mean that they can't be forgiven. It doesn't mean that they don't deserve the love that God gives to all of us, but they deserve it sitting in the third pew of the church, not standing in the pulpit. And
Right.
if it includes children and a minor, they don't belong in the church at all, anywhere near children. And, my situation was a little different because, not different, but yes, I was a minor, but I was a teenager. And then, of course, I was closer to 20 and 21. So I fell in between that. I was an adult, but not an adult. And so I was treated like an adult. But, if we're talking about 5, 6-year-old, 10-year-old, 12-year-olds, that's against the law.
Yeah.
And church leadership, you report it to the police. You don't have a meeting. You don't discuss it with the elders. You report it immediately. There is no question that should ever arise as to whether or not, when it involves a minor, that you don't report it. So, church leadership, when it comes with an adult, that's still sexual abuse. That is an abuse of someone under their care. A doctor has sex with one of their patients, they lose their license. No questions asked. A school teacher, in fact, had he been my school teacher, he would have been breaking the law. But at that time, 16 was the age of consent. Even though, now it's different, it's 18. But even if at that time, at age 16, I couldn't give consent to a teacher, and he would have been breaking the law, but not a pastor. So, the state laws vary on all that, but it doesn't. Churches shouldn't say, okay, well, it's technically a law or not a law. That's not what churches should be in the business of. We need to be talking to the victims and saying, we're going to support the victims because this should not have happened in our church. Should not have happened. And we're going to do everything we can to help the victim. We're going to do what we can to help the offending pastor, but we're not going to return him to the pulpit. We're not going to give him a second chance to reoffend. And that's what happens when you give pastors second chances. A truly repentant man would understand the devastation that is caused and would say, I'm not fit for ministry.
Right. We talked before we went on the air that I'm credentialed in the Assemblies of God, and I know that when a pastor has fallen into an adulterous affair or any kind of sexual immorality, there's a restoration process where they will work with that repentant pastor for healing before he's allowed or she is allowed back in the pulpit. But to sweep it under the rug, pretend it didn't happen, and for this pastor, this was not his second chance, because you said earlier that there was an accusation early on from his former church. So this was somebody that had a pattern, and it's unfortunate that it wasn't recognized in a way to protect you. And then I know that this pastor has gone on to hurt other people when you moved on.
By his own admission, there were many. Now, they weren't teenagers necessarily, they were adult women. But when a woman is in an invulnerable position, she's emotionally compromised, she's going through a divorce, she's not thinking clearly. And her coping skills are not what they would be if she were in a healthy place. And so that's why when these men take advantage, that's why we say it's abuse, because they have taken advantage and they target these women. They look for people who are vulnerable. They look for someone who has a need, and then they fill that need, and they allow that person to become emotionally dependent upon them, to then they eventually sexualize the relationship, and then they isolate that person and keep them in that relationship with a lot of times with consequences and guilt and fear. And so we've got to understand, and I think that's where some churches fail. They just see it as two people had an affair. Well, no, they didn't have an affair. This man who should have been within the boundaries of his ministry went out of those boundaries, and it was always his job to stay within those boundaries. He is the one that's at fault. He took advantage of someone under his care. The Bible mentions wolves in sheep's clothing and false prophets 27 times. So it's not a surprise, or shouldn't be a surprise, that we find these men in our churches, because we've been warned they're going to be there. What we need to now do is, what do we do with them once we find them? And we talked about restoration, and I think that is a good thing. But the goal of restoration should be returning them back to Christ, not necessarily back to the pulpit. When the goal is set, okay, we're going to work with him so we can get him back to the ministry. That these men are clever, and they say, that's my probation for an hour, for a year, for 2. I can do that. So I caution churches on that. It's just. It's a little, makes me a little nervous. Just, be careful what the goal is, because it shouldn't be just to get them back to the, to the ministry. And some of them are not fit. and I've often said, well, if the church treasurer was stealing funds from the church, we wouldn't say, okay, let's, put him back a year later, he'll be okay because we worked with him. I mean, we would probably not let him be near the church funds again once he's stolen from the church. And these men steal souls. They steal souls. My spiritual life will never be the same. I will never have the same joy within a church. And that's certainly gotten better. And as I'm healing, I pray now, I read the Bible, all those things that I couldn't do, I can do now. But I had 27 years where that didn't happen. And I missed it. I mourned that loss. And he took that away from me. He took it away.
So after you're kind of asked to leave or asked to find another church, 27 years pass by. Are you ever in a church during those 27 years, or is it sporadic, or what happened?
No, I had 2 children, and I decided that I did not want them to be without a church life because of something that had happened to me. So I took them to church. My husband would go most of the time. But I took them to church. I got them involved in the church because I wanted them to have that experience, but I could not engage with them. I never discussed anything with them. I never discussed the Bible. My children never had a bedtime prayer with their mother. And that's probably the most hurtful thing for me. I didn't have that special because I couldn't pray. I couldn't do it. It was a trigger factor for me. It was a reminder. I just couldn't do it. And so when I did finally tell my kids about it, I said to them, I will always regret that I couldn't give you the spiritual life and the church life that I would have given you had this not been done to me. So yes, I went to church, but I couldn't engage. I was constantly asked, teach Sunday school or do something, and I just found a reason not to. I couldn't listen to prayer. I never listened to anything that was read from the Bible. I basically was just there so that my kids could be there.
So what triggered the change to finally pursue healing and to open up to your family and to your husband about all this?
Well, I was driving down to a golf tournament that my daughter was playing in college, and that was the days before GPS. So I had this little big old triptych and a road map, and I'm driving down this expressway, and I see a sign that says Queen's Gate 1 mile, and that's the church that he had moved to after leaving our church. And it just sent me over the edge. I started crying. I felt like he was in the car with me. I couldn't breathe. So I pulled to the side of the road and I just began sobbing. And I sat there and just sobbed for probably an hour, 45 minutes. I just let every pain that I was feeling, every hurt that I'd ever felt was now coming out. And I thought, I've got to do something with this because it's not going back. I mean, I had trigger factors throughout the years. I described many of them in the book, but I was always able to kind of suppress them or manage them. This one I just knew it wasn't going back, and I had to deal with it. And so for about 2 weeks, I was just in a mess. And then I finally told my best friend, and I eventually then told my husband. And then I made a decision that I was going to find my abuser and confront him. I had some spiritual counseling from a couple that I was very close to. I trusted their judgment spiritually. And he said to me, you're to go to the one who's offended you, Matthew 18:15 through 17. And as scared as I was to do that, I felt that it would be important to my healing to be able to look at him and say, you had no right to do what you did to me. And so I hired a private investigator. I found him ministering in a church in Alabama, and I confronted him. And I have to say that I was disappointed. I mainly because he didn't really get what he had done to me. He never understood, and I don't think he wanted to take the credit for my lack of spiritual life. I think he saw that as, well, if you want to have God in your life, you have God in your life. I didn't have any, and he didn't get that part. I mean, his response was, I know that I took away your teenage years. Yeah, they weren't normal teenage years, but that's not what, had the pain in my life was not from the fact that there wasn't an issue. So I was disappointed. And he also began to explain why he was the way he was. And he started playing the victim a little bit. And so I was disappointed, but I'm not sorry that I did it, because I think it was important for me to have done that. And I know not all victims can do that. And I was fortunate in that he couldn't deny it. So many victims, if they confront their abuser, especially years later, they're going to say, she doesn't know what she's talking about. That never happened. I knew he couldn't do that. And so that made it a little bit easier for me to confront him.
He chose a very hard place, though, to meet, almost as if he wanted to avoid the confrontation altogether.
Well, the other thing about his response, when my investigator called him, his response was, I don't want to meet her. I don't want the church to know. I mean, he hadn't told any of his elders. They had no idea of his past. And so he was trying to hide, his past, which told me he still wasn't repentant or hadn't dealt with it. And instead of trying to avoid meeting me, his first word should have been, I will do whatever it is to help her. And that's not how he responded. He didn't want to meet on the church grounds. He didn't want anyone to know. His elders didn't know. His boss or supervisor knew some things. He didn't know very much about his past, but knew there'd been an issue, he said. And so, he chose to meet at a hotel lobby, which was ironic. And but I should have insisted that we meet at the church. But at the time, I was so afraid he would refuse to meet me that I didn't want to jeopardize that. And so I agreed not to meet at the church. But in hindsight, I would have insisted on that, just because it's a church matter and I had nothing to hide and he should have had nothing to hide. But he was very fearful of people finding out.
Yeah. So you met at the church lobby. His response didn't give you anything, but you had the opportunity to give him the chance, even in that moment, to find repentance and maybe healing for himself.
Right.
But it doesn't seem like he's taken that at all.
No, and so to add to that, to really, which to me solidified why I knew he wasn't repentant, he asked me in the meeting, he said to me, not for my sake, but for your sake, you should forgive me. And I said to him, yes, you're right. I do need to forgive you, but I can't forgive you unless you really know what you did to me. And so I gave him a list of 20 things that he needed to read back to me. So I think it started out, it was wrong of me to take your virginity. It was wrong of me to kiss you in your hallway. So I made him read this list. And at the end of the list, I said I would try to forgive him. About 3 weeks later, he calls me irate because he understood that I was still talking about this abuse. He didn't call it abuse, that I was still talking about this. And that if I had really forgiven him, I wouldn't be talking about this. He was angry. He was furious with me. And I thought, this is just what he did 20-something years ago. He was, if he were repentant, that's not how you respond to a victim. And forgiveness does not mean I remain silent. That's not what forgiveness means. So that was another indication to me. And the fact that he was hiding his past, no, that doesn't, it's not what you do if you're really repentant.
Yeah. Have you found a place where you have, it doesn't eliminate the scars, it doesn't eliminate the memories, but have you found a place where you say, yes, he is definitely forgiven and the church is forgiven for the second hurt?
Absolutely. And it took me about 2 years to get to that point, because I had to understand what forgiveness meant. And this is for victims of it or anyone who's carrying a hurt that they can't let go of. It's not about forgetting. It's not about condoning the behavior. And it doesn't mean there are consequences. That's not what forgiveness means. For me, I finally understood that it was meant that I had to unburden myself from this man and let God take it. And that's, for 2 years, I was angry. I was frustrated by the church response. And I let that frustration and that anger eat away at me. For the first 27 years, it was guilt and shame. Now I was letting the anger and frustration. And I wasn't living the life that God meant for me to live. Because as long as I held on to that hateful feeling, that frustration, that anger, he was still in my life. He was still controlling my life. Mm-hmm. He wasn't out of my life. He was still there. And so I had to say, God, you need to take this. Sometimes the word forgiveness is hard. So I just started out by saying, I'm going to unburden myself and let God take this away from me. And once I did that and I understood that, I was able to forgive him. I'm not angry. I'm sad that he's still in the ministry. I think it's not a place he should be, but I have to let God handle that. And so all I can do is share my story to help other victims, to share my story so that churches can raise an awareness about this. And maybe, okay, how do we work through this? And how should we treat a victim? Maybe we're not doing it right. And by hearing my story and other stories, they can learn from us and what they can do. And so forgiveness was hard. I think the other thing about it was hard for me was that if I forgave him, I was being unfaithful to my pain. That somehow I was saying, well, it really wasn't that bad. I was able to forgive him. And so I had to let go of that feeling that, no, the pain can still be there, but you can still forgive. And so that's but it was probably a 2-year process before I was able to really say, I've forgiven him and I'm not going to let him be a part of my life anymore.
As you're talking there, I'm getting the image of Christ, Jesus on the cross, praying for forgiveness for those that are crucifying him. Him forgiving them didn't take the pain of the nails or the crown of thorns away. It didn't take away the fact that he was about to die.
Or that they were wrong.
Yeah, exactly. They were still definitely in the wrong. They were still definitely murdering an innocent man. But his forgiveness did not take that from them. But it was him unloading the burden. As he was carrying all the sins, he was unloading it from himself and demonstrating to us that even in the most painful circumstance, we can forgive under his power.
Right.
Without God, I don't think that you could have forgiven this pastor or the church or the other people that have hurt you. It had to be a forgiveness that came from him.
Right. And the other thing that helped me in forgiving the church, and I'm so thankful they did this for me. I requested a meeting of that church, of the current elders. Now, none of them were there at the time, and I wasn't looking to blame any of them. But what that church did to me was wrong, and they needed to acknowledge that. It didn't matter that they weren't there at the time, but that body as a whole needed to look at me and say they were sorry and that I was welcome back in that church. And they did. I'm so thankful that they were able to do that because I knew that was part of my healing as well, that I needed to hear from that church that I was welcome back in that church.
Yeah. And we're all part of the body, so we all carry some of the responsibilities. So I agree that it was very important for them, even if nothing else, as a symbolic understanding that, we are one body, and when one part of the body hurts, we all hurt. And so...
And I think for me, it was important too to tell the truth and tell the story as I knew the story to be, and not what he had left there when he gave the story of what had happened. And so for me, it was also about the truth telling, to say, okay, I'm going to tell you the truth, whether you believe it or not, but here's the truth of what really did happen. And that I was manipulated and I was taken advantage of as a teenager by this man. And so that was important as well.
Yeah. So what is your advice as somebody who's been through this for somebody, or what would you like to say to anybody that might be watching or listening that may have experienced this?
Well, the first thing you need to understand is that it's not your fault. And that took me a long time because victims carry a tremendous amount of guilt. We want to think, what could have I done differently? What should I have said? You did what you could at the time for who you were and the coping skills that you had. And you should have been able to trust this person in a place that should have been the safest place on earth. So don't blame yourself. It's not your fault. That's the first thing. The second thing I like to tell victims is that educate yourself. Read all you can on not just the clergy abuse, but abuse in general. Learn what grooming is. Learn what manipulation is. Learn gaslighting, because all of those techniques, whether you know it now or not, were used on you to trap you. And know that you were targeted. You weren't just chosen out of the thin air and, oh, this just happened. They looked for vulnerable people, and you were vulnerable and in a place that you could not defend yourself. So educate yourself. Learning all you can. It's powerful. That was so important to me to understand what was really done to me. Then I would suggest you find a support group. And that may be difficult, not only just with COVID, but even in a group setting. But there are so many places that you can go on the online or on the internet. I work with the Hope of Survivors ministry. It's you can just Google it, the Hope of Survivors. They have one-on-one counseling. Their website is excellent as far as information that can help victims. In the back of my book, I list several places to go on the internet where you can actually go and talk to someone. There are Facebook groups that are private that you can share your thoughts. So find a support group. And then finally, and the hardest part of all, if you're holding this secret in, you need to tell someone. And I don't say that lightly. I spent 27 years hiding my secret. I spent 27 years worrying someone was going to find out what I had done. And all that does is create more guilt and more shame and more fear. So I know it's hard, but you need to tell someone. And maybe you look for someone outside the church, especially if it's someone that you think they're close to your abuser, the minister, the rabbi, or the priest. But you need to tell someone. And it may start in a group setting with these, like these internet group settings where I'm talking about these support groups. But talk to someone and know that it was not your fault.
Absolutely. And that first step is always going to be the hardest, is because your trust has been broken once before.
Right.
How do you put yourself out there again? And it takes prayer, and you got to have that one friend that you have close enough that it can help you through and be able to find somebody.
And God knows your heart, and God's going to protect your tender soul. I used to say, well, I'm going to get to heaven someday, and I'm not going to ever hear the words, "Well done, thy good and faithful servant." And I thought that's something I'm never going to hear, because I'm not a servant of God anymore. He knows your heart. He knows why you're suffering. He knows your disconnect from him, if there is one. So you trust that God's big enough to understand, because he is.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The book is called "Let Me Pray Upon You" instead of "Let Me Pray With You." I really like the way the book cover is laid out. How was that? How were you inspired with that, or how did that come about for the title?
I had the title long before I wrote the book. I can remember, he'd say, "Let's pray," or "Let me pray with you," and I think, he didn't pray with me. He just prayed upon me. And so the title, and then the wolf and the sheep analogy, that's the analogy the Bible uses constantly of warning us of these wolves in sheep's clothing. And so that was, the title I had from the very beginning. And I do like my title.
Yeah. With the title, it's very clever, but it's also very poignant, because, like you said, the wolf in sheep's clothing, somebody that seems harmless, that everybody likes, everybody trusts.
Yeah.
A lot of times we think that these kind of things happen with, the weird guy that hides in the corner.
Right.
But a lot of times it's in plain sight. We just have to be, as members of the body, a little bit discerning and realize that if we, like you mentioned very early on, if we feel something in our gut, chances are that's the Holy Spirit giving us a poke, saying, "Hey, there's something. There's something there. One of the sheep, one of God's sheep, needs a little bit of help right now."
And look for those vulnerable people, whether they're adults or children. Look for the child that's parents are divorced, like mine were. Look for the child that's having trouble in school and no one likes. Those are the ones that these men, and sometimes women, will prey upon. And so they need another eye looking out for them. And then you've got, women in the church who are going through divorce, or their husband has left them or whatever. Those are the vulnerable women that are going to have a need that these men will look to fill in order to take advantage of them.
Yeah. So the book is very powerful. It's a powerful story. There's so much that we could have talked about, but we can't have an 8-hour podcast. But I highly recommend the book. Pick it up at Sandy Phillips Kirkham.com, or you can also connect with her on Facebook at Kirkham Author. And
it's available on Amazon as well.
It's available on Amazon. So support the book. Give it to somebody that you know that's been through this. Maybe they can let God use it so that they can be healed, and also share this story so that more people who have been through this will find their voice. And
for church leaders, I encourage church leadership to read it as well, because I think there's, like I said, it's a part of an education too.
Yeah, absolutely. So church leaders. One thing that has struck me lately has been how many church leaders will, quote unquote, fall into some sort of sin. And it usually doesn't happen with one fell swoop. There's always a few compromises that develop along the way. And so encourage every church leader, develop a system of accountability. The Billy Graham rule is a great way to protect your pastors and your congregants, especially from, like you were mentioning, the vulnerable people who are going through a death or divorce or even a military deployment overseas for long periods of time. All these different people are vulnerable, and if you protect them with accountability, you protect the body of Christ and allow the body of Christ to continue to serve and do its mission.
Yes, exactly.
So, not to be irreverent of the story, because it's a powerful story, and I really hope that anybody that is in leadership will take it to heart. Anybody that's been through this will take it to heart and realize that you're not alone. No matter what the abuser has told you or is telling you, you're not alone. There are people, and there are people praying for you. Find your voice and come forward, and let's start rooting the evil out of churches. So again, not to be irreverent, we have the two final segments. So the fact that God has brought you to this place where you're able to speak about it and to share shows the power of God's healing, because without it, that 27 years could easily have been 47 years.
Right.
But God has brought you to this point where you're now using that pain, and God causes all things to work for the good of those who love Him, who are called according to His purposes. So, and like Joseph said, what you meant for evil and harm, God is using for good.
Right.
And so it stinks, but like you said, you thought you weren't going to hear it. I believe you will, because now you're using what the enemy intended for harm, and you'll get that well done, good and faithful servant, because you're helping others heal. And
thank you.
Hopefully and prayerfully, you're preventing more hurt, because people will start waking up to the fact that without accountability, without protection, without wisdom, the church is as dangerous as the world sometimes. So please check out the book. Please follow our guest on social media. And with that said, let us go to our first of the final two segments, and this is called The Interrogation. 7 quick questions, randomly created. Probably no other place in the interview for them. So the first question is, what do you do for fun other than talk to me on podcasts?
I play with my grandchildren, and I play golf, and I watch a lot of Andy Griffith.
Nice. Do you play enough to have a handicap, or do you just go out there and...
Wait a minute, I lost you a minute. I lost you a minute.
Do you have a handicap, or?
No, I just play the game loose. Use the term loosely. I play very loosely.
All right, question number 2: what's a secret skill or talent that you have?
I can walk on my toes.
Like that.
I can curl my toes under and walk on my toes.
There you go. That works.
Yeah, you asked.
Question number 3: what is your or where is your dream vacation?
Switzerland.
Ooh, nice. Any particular area, or just Switzerland?
Lucerne, the Bern area. I've been there once. I probably am not going to get back, but I would love to go back someday. But I do have the memories when I was there the first time.
Awesome. Question number 4: what's something that you wish you were better at?
Oh, I wish I could paint. I'm not better at it. I can't paint at all, but I wish I could paint.
Nice. Okay. And question number 5, what's your favorite story in the Bible?
That's a tough one because I have several. Probably the woman at the well.
Okay. Very nice. And that's one of my favorite scenes in The Chosen. I don't know if you've seen that.
I have not, but I should. Yeah.
It kind of ends season 1, and it's powerful. So,
I know. Everybody talks about it, so I do need to check that out. I got to stop watching Andy Griffith.
Nothing wrong with a little bit of Andy.
Yeah.
So question number 6, tell us, you and Bill's, which is your husband, what are your pet names for each other?
Oh, I don't think we really have any. But Mom, well, it's Grandma and Grandpa now. We call each other Grandma and Grandpa because of the 2 kids. But otherwise, it's Mom and Dad. I don't think we ever use our names.
Yeah, that's my wife and I. We it's always Babe or something.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever used our names.
All right, final question. If I know that it was made into a documentary, or your story is a documentary, but if Let Me Pray Upon You was ever a movie, who would you want to play you?
Sandra Bullock.
Ooh.
I think that would be a good match.
Very good. All right. So our final question is for anyone that's looking to step up and use their gifts, and whether that's their talents, their passions, or even their experiences, what would your wise counsel be for them?
I would say, first of all, don't underestimate the power of God and what he can do. I think we all think, well, I'm not smart enough, or I'm not talented enough, or that's not something I could do. I would say, let God guide you into that, because, I certainly had no intention of ever sharing my story or being out in the public with my life. And real quickly, the first speaking engagement that I was offered was at the Cincinnati Christian University to talk to seminary students. And I said, there is no way I'm sitting in a room full of ministers. This was early on. I'm not going to happen. And I can remember just thinking, okay, well, maybe I should. And then I thought, God kept pushing me to do this. And then someone else mentioned it. So I think use your gifts that God's given you, because that's what they're there for. And he'll take care of it. I mean, you just go out there and do it. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have anything great to say or do, but whatever it is, do it and just do it.
Absolutely. Just do it, as the old non-sponsored tennis shoe company says.
Yeah.
But I encourage visit sandyphillipskirkham.com or Facebook at Kirkham Author. If you're looking for a good read, whether it's for healing within your own life, or as a church leader, you're looking for what signs that you can be on the lookout for, the book is Let Me Pray Upon You. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on the website. It's a powerful story, and it's going to help a lot of people. So I am glad that and really thrilled that you actually went through and created it. And I know that it's going to do some healing and helping people. So thank you so much for being part of the show. And we pray that you'll just continue to heal, because these are deep scars. And I know that there are moments where those scars will flare back up, even though it's not the same pain. It you get those reminders.
Right.
And I pray that you'll just continue to overcome and continue to heal.
Well, I appreciate that very much.
Absolutely. For our show next week, we got a couple of shows coming up, because April is National Humor Month. So we are going to start bringing on some comedians. Our first one is going to be Mark Christopher Lawrence. He's got a dry bar special, Clean Out of Compton. You might have seen him on the TV show Chuck, or the movie Pursuit of Happiness, or the recent release with Leland Clausen, Sleeper Agent. He's going to be on the show next week. And then the following week, as we continue National Humor Month, is comedian Kyle Yamada. 2 great guys, and it's going to be a lot of fun to have those guys on. And again, check out the book, Let Me Pray Upon You. You can find it at our website. You can find it on Amazon. Really a great resource. And Sandy, thank you so much for coming on and sharing, and thank you for being willing to share your pain so that God can use it to heal others.
Thank you. I've enjoyed the show very much.
Thank you. All right, everyone, have a great night.